Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Stephen Roy Goodman. I'm here at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where we're going to be speaking about various aspects of recycling. And I've got three guests with me today. Anesu Makina, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the African Center for Cities. Melanie Ludwig is the chairperson of the Organics Recycling Association of South Africa. And Bulelani Ndzuzo, who is an alum of the Stepping Stone course, which is the group that's organizing this taping right now, and who's involved in a group called Keep Mbekweni Clean. Welcome to all of you.
Welcome. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, thanks for coming on. Anesu, maybe if we can start with you. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the organic and the inorganic and all the recycling that goes on in South Africa?
Yes, thank you, Steve. So South Africa doesn't have a centralized recycling system. Instead, it comprises of private organizations, community organizations, and individuals known as waste pickers or reclaimers. So private organizations are usually contracted by municipalities to provide waste or garbage collection services, and sometimes they'll provide recycling facilities as well. So they'll give the household or the company a clear bag to separate their recyclables. And then with waste pickers or reclaimers, those are individuals who usually salvage people's bins. So when your bins are brought out, they'll go into the bins, they'll take out the materials that are recyclable, and they'll take them to a place known as a buyback center where they'll sell those recyclables. And informal and waste pickers or reclaimers also work at landfills where once the trash collection truck tips the items at the landfill, there'll also be others who'll be working there also removing recyclable materials to sell.
And why aren't the municipal authorities doing this? Why do you need the waste pickers to do that?
The waste pickers have been doing this for a really long time. So studies in South Africa have shown that there have been waste pickers operating at landfills since the 1980s. So they've been doing this a long time, and they also do it primarily for economic gain. So they're probably just much more efficient at it than, say, the municipalities who probably have to have other departments involved in other procurement processes, which would actually just make and complicate their own waste removal processes.
And if we can move to Mbekweni, so Bulelani, so are some of the people who you work with waste pickers who are bringing them back to those centers as well?
Certainly, yes, Steve. Thank you for having me. So some of the young people that I work with are people who are usually exposed to drugs, people who are street dwellers, they are the ones that are actually more on emphasis than picking waste, because they're doing it to get some food on the table, and they're also doing it to get another hit to actually be on drugs, So those are the people that I work with in Mbekweni. And I think what our local government has not been too much at the forefront is because they want to actually, to some extent, sabotage them because they know that they are vulnerable to actually holding them accountable or in instances like that. So Keep Mbekweni Clean has been there to actually advocate for them. Now we have a temporary illegal dumping site where they can actually come and pick up the stuff so that they can take it to the buyback centers.
And who runs or owns these buyback centers?
So like the previous guest explained, is mostly private entities. And in my area, I know that my local government also actually owns a buyback center, which is now just being built. So mostly these private entities, because they are now the ones who are contracted by government, So I think in that sense, it will be an emphasis that private entities do own these buyback centers.
Fair enough. And Melanie, you, if I understand this correctly, work with organic waste. Can you maybe explain what the difference is between organic and non-organic waste?
So organic waste is anything that used to be alive. So food waste, paper waste, yard or garden waste can be classified as organic. And we do definitely see a lot of organic waste in residential waste bins. So it can be between 30 and 50% can be organic. And so this waste stream it's not got a value that a waste picker can actually sell. So often that is the waste that is going into landfills. The main thing with food waste is that it contaminates everything else. So it actually reduces the recycling percentages of the plastic, paper, glass, or tins that are being collected. So by getting that out at source through source separation programs, which are run very successfully in America, in Canada, and Europe, would help definitely to increase the waste that's available for waste pickers to recycle, and also make it more humane for them to sort waste through in bins.
Well, you just mentioned other places, and I know that you did some work in Baltimore, Maryland. Maybe if you can explain a little bit what you were doing in Baltimore in terms of recycling. So
in America, they have the U.S. Composting Council. They are very active in driving organics recycling in municipalities, and then doing a lot of awareness and support for those involved in separating and processing organic waste into new products, for example, compost, or making biogas from organic waste. So that's the US Composting Council. So they are doing amazing things there. And so I was going to learn on what they all do and how we can implement that here.
Well, let's move to Mbekweni. What are you doing in Mbekweni to deal with some of the organic waste?
So in Mbekweni, we started a campaign called Keep Mbekweni Clean. It was due to the increasing number of illegal dumping that were happening in my area. So we have law enforcement that is supposed to actually fine everyone who's illegally dumping. But because of whatsoever, that is not being on emphasis, you know. So what we actually advocating for in Mbekweni is to say, look, there is money in waste. And instead of actually just throwing waste, you can actually recycle it. And all these processes, just my guest just explained, are actually worth it, you know. So what we did in Mbekweni then, we then encouraged young people from school level to actually start recycling paper, start recycling plastic. And actually, we actually advocated for a temporary dumping site in all the areas in townships, because you know that townships are always confined and you find more waste than in other suburban areas, you know. So I think that much must be actually directed into actually having illegal dumping site into townships, so that we can actually mitigate all this waste that is going everywhere.
And in the townships, but is there a difference between what happens with the organic recycling and the non-organic or recycling in the townships? Is that different than in the suburbs? Is that what you're alluding to?
Not necessarily that is what I'm alluding to, Steve, but I'm saying that the narrative in township is not necessarily to actually have an end product with organic waste, but in townships, it's more like getting a meal. You know, it's more like actually I want something to eat and I don't have a job, and illegal dumping and recycling is the only thing I can do, you know. So like from recycling paper, the recycling tins, those are the things that are mostly on emphasis, you know, because there are buyback centers that are there at their disposal for them to actually exchange. So it's mostly to actually get a meal on the table, and to actually it's mostly the people who are street dwellers that are on emphasis in illegal dumping.
Fair enough. And Anesu, is it so? You're a researcher. Do you find that what Bulelani is describing is true throughout Africa?
In some ways, with regards to illegal dumping, yes. So one of the challenges around waste management broadly across the continent is that there isn't sufficient infrastructure to provide waste collection. So, for example, in a lot of countries, you have informal settlements. Even here in South Africa, a lot of informal settlements, and they're densely populated areas. So what we find is that the waste collection trucks are too big to go into the communities to collect the trash. So oftentimes, either they'll have a centralized collection point where people have to walk to dump their waste, or they actually won't provide services at all. So then people end up dumping illegally, or just finding, or even burning their waste as well.
And then what happens to that waste? It just stays there?
When it's dumped illegally, yes, it actually just stays there, and it becomes an environmental hazard. So, for example, you find rats and other vermin coming there and then, spreading diseases. In some cases too, snakes feed on rats. So you find that now the community also has an increase in snakes as well. So, and it's complicated because I think with what Melanie was talking about, like with organic waste, it doesn't have a lot of value. So if people can't take it out of the waste stream and recycle it, it actually just stays there, causing environmental damage and social and problems for the community.
So then, maybe I'll throw this to all of you. So would you say then that it's a good thing that there's this informal community of people who are picking waste, because otherwise it's just going to stay there?
I think to come into this, Dave, it is a good thing to some extent, because number one, I think it mitigates unemployment, you know, because if there are no, if the people who are actually picking up waste are not there, then they will be actually adding up to the numbers of unemployment, you know. So they are actually doing things for themselves instead of actually begging the government for a job, you know. And also, in referencing to organic waste, I think it also adds value to the food chain, you know, because with compost, you can actually plant some fruits, some vegetables, so that you can sustain yourself. So to some extent, yes, I think it is a good thing.
So what is happening in township areas, if there's illegal dumping, you do find there's a lot of scavenging by dogs and other animals. And in some rural municipalities, they're actually collecting food waste to feed to pigs, which can be a problem with animal health. So there is an informal market for food waste in townships and rural, and even in Cape Town. They are collecting food waste from restaurants to feed to pigs. So that is a way of recycling food waste in particular. But we haven't seen a big movement within townships to take organic waste, separate it, and compost it to create community gardens, maybe on a small scale. But that possibly would be the ideal way of dealing with the organics within an informal settlement, to have community gardens where that could be taken and turned into compost for the benefit of the community.
And do any of the groups that you work with, because you have an association
Yes.
that you represent,
Yes.
I assume there are multiple members of this association.
Yeah.
Do any of those members do anything kind of like what you just described?
So we mainly find it from the non-profit organizations. There are several gardening organizations in Cape Town that will do backyard gardening, help people, train them, provide them with the tools and compost. And definitely compost is part of that training, where they would be able to learn how to make their own compost for their backyard. Our members of our organization are all industry members that are commercial industries that are providing services to waste generators. So they are producing it to either get rid of the waste so it's not landfilled, and produce a product. So those two main aims is what our members are, because we're an industry body. It's normally the non-profit organizations that go into townships who are looking to create community gardens, create food security, that will also handle composting to deal with some of the organic waste coming out of those areas.
And in terms of that waste, so in terms of Mbekweni, if you're trying to keep Mbekweni clean, how are you doing that exactly? Are you saying we're going to collect the trash every Saturday? Are you saying 100 people are going to come and clean up an area? Or are you saying we're going to give an incentive for people to raise the money to hire them to pick the waste?
So we've been knocking on the doors of local government for quite some time, in the respective to actually have a recycling swap shop, which I feel might actually to some extent also mitigate the alarming number of illegal dumping. Number two, what we do regular cleanups every weekend, because most the municipalities in my area actually collects our bins maybe once a week. So maybe that is not enough to some extent. So therefore, we have advocated to actually having cleanups, and we actually called on a number of groups in Mbekweni, respectively our youth centers and our other social civil societies, to actually join hands and actually cleanups in every weekend. So we also have a campaign with our local government that we collaborated on that called Keep My Community Clean. That's where they are actually the best area that is clean is being given something. Maybe it's a surprise, not actually in value of money, but it's just to empower young people and also residents in those communities to say that, you know what, keeping should be an emphasis and it should be a fashion. That's the only way. That's actually the start of actually ensuring that we mitigate illegal dumping.
What about the issue of pride, about the issue of being proud of your community? I don't remember which community in the United States had a campaign, but there was a city that had a campaign to keep a particular city clean on the grounds that you, the citizens, should feel proud of your city and you want to keep it clean. Is there anything like that in Africa or in South Africa in particular? Any initiative like that?
So you've got various campaigns and processes. So for example, in some of the schools here, you've got competitions like cleanest school competitions. And so basically those are competitions where students clean up the school and then they can win a prize. And they're often provincial competitions and even national competitions. And more recently, the president launched the Good Green Deeds campaign, which also involves cleanups in various communities as well. And basically this year, the campaign I think was launched in 2019, and it's managed by the National Department of Environmental Affairs. And more recently, they're trying to invigorate that campaign.
That's interesting. And your research, have you found that in other places throughout Africa as well? I thought your research was interesting because it wasn't just South Africa, it was other parts of Africa as well. Have you found some of those larger campaigns in other places as well?
I know that in some places they've had those campaigns, but I'm not too familiar with that. So I know in some places you've got like cleanup days, but I don't have any specifics on that.
And you're in favor of the cleanup days?
I think it's good to keep communities clean. And I think that it should be more of an everyday thing. But I also think that sometimes we need to look at the infrastructure deficits that are preventing people from keeping communities clean. So rather than dedicating a particular day to clean up, right? It should be a situation whereby people have the right tools to be able to keep their communities clean. So, for example, what I mentioned earlier about issues of infrastructure, you find that in some communities, because of population density, there aren't enough bins provided for the community. So you find that the bins actually overflow. So people want to keep their communities clean, but they can't. And then you're also finding that sometimes the bins provided don't accommodate the types of waste streams that the communities generate. So for example, right now, there's a big issue with disposable diapers because, sometimes people don't have space in there. Like I'm saying, well, for example, that if there aren't enough bins, the bins overflow, right? So people are less likely to keep the diapers in their house. They want to take them to the bin. The bins are full, or maybe the communal bin is too far, or maybe your community doesn't have waste services, so you're likely going to dump those diapers, right? And diapers are also difficult to burn because of the kinds of materials that they're made of. So you find that diapers end up blocking drains, for example. But if the government were able to provide the suitable bins and disposable facilities for things such as diapers, people would likely just put them there.
That's very interesting. And something you said before I thought was interesting as well, that about the infrastructure, that some of the trash trucks can't navigate some of the crowded areas in South Africa. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
So does South Africa need smaller trucks, or how I'll throw it to all of you. So what should happen, or what would you recommend that happens?
Well, because I'm more exposed to the township myself, that is true, Steve. Some of the municipality trucks can't actually navigate these areas because if it's not cables that are wiring all over the house, all over the spaces, it's crowded, So they tend to be neglected in an instant of actually their waste being picked up. So it comes back to the point where my case just highlighted that you see that people throwing diapers, which has actually a health and hygiene hazard, So I think to some extent, that's why, as a young person who's actually living in those communities, wanted to start this campaign to say that, look, apart from just the waste dumping there needs to be an education element to it, If you don't know what to do with your waste, you will just throw it there, So I've been knocking on doors to actually say that, look, we need to have educational workshops to teach them what to do with their waste instead of just dumping it there. So it is an issue that I am trying to address, but because there's so many politics in between. It is hard to actually get to the right direction.
Well, let's make it a little more individual. So let's take the example of the diaper. What would you recommend that somebody do with that diaper if they can't throw it in a bin?
Look, Steve, last week there was an initiative that I started at home from my own personal perception, where instead of actually just having one bin at home, I tried to actually create 4 other bins at home with some cardboard or putting plastic inside, so that when there's things like diapers that I can't just throw away, I can try and store them there, so that when the municipality comes and actually tries and collect them, I can take them myself to the buyback centers and try and see that maybe what they can do about it, because I don't know what to do about it. That's why I'm saying that the educational element needs to come in, so that I can be aware of what can I do with my diaper. Maybe there's something I can change into it, or there's an end product I can do it. Maybe it comes to the element of organic waste, which is why I'm saying that the education element should be an emphasis, and on a daily basis, like my guest highlighted.
And in terms of the organic waste, so how is this working on, let's say, the big restaurants in downtown Cape Town or downtown Johannesburg? They must produce a ton of waste, a ton of organic waste. Where does it go?
So if they are not separating it, it goes in general waste, it goes into the landfill, and that would be collected by the municipality. And none of the municipalities in South Africa are requiring food waste to be separated at source. So it will go into general waste. In Cape Town, we do have quite a thriving new industry of composting and using the food waste, so collecting businesses, private businesses collecting from restaurants and hotels, source-separated food waste to be taken for composting. So there are several companies that can do that. So that is all because of the city of Cape Town that have made it possible to work in this place by raising the cost of landfilling, because that now has triggered a space for us as private businesses to provide services to restaurants and hotels. So as landfill gets more expensive, then it becomes more economically viable to recycle food waste or other waste streams into new products, because we need to charge for collection and processing costs. So that is really why Cape Town has a thriving organic waste service recycling system compared to the rest of the country.
But that's good from where I'm sitting, because if you're saying that you're producing less waste and making better use of the available landfills, everybody benefits from that, if I'm hearing that correctly.
Yes, definitely we can make products from that waste stream. Unfortunately, in other municipalities around South Africa, the cost of landfilling is very low. So there's no incentive, there's no financial incentive to change, put in a source separation system, get a private company to take that waste and to turn it into something valuable like compost.
So what would you advise somebody to do about that? Just how do you change the economic situation in terms of what the value would be in a landfill in one city versus another? How does one change that?
Well, we are relying on the municipalities to set their tariffs at realistic prices, because often they don't factor in the closure of those landfills in 20 years' time and the negative environmental effects. So that comes down to proper accounting on the municipality side. But as soon as you put a gate fee at the landfill, you can have more illegal dumping. And that's where enforcement has to come in to ensure that people pay for their waste and pay for the responsible disposal of their waste, and then also pay for recycling services, because recycling organics costs money. It's not like selling tins. It has a cost to it. It's not an income. So organic waste is very different like that.
And so Bulelani's group would be essentially operate in a different way if it was in Durban or if it was in Johannesburg than it would if it's in metropolitan Cape Town.
So there's still good prices for things like metals and plastics and papers in those other towns. And so there would be buyback centers or markets to sell those items into, definitely. But the thing with organics, especially food or yard waste, garden waste, there's a cost to process it. You don't get money for that waste. So it's a different economic model, really.
And speaking of the economic model, we're going to have to say goodbye in a moment. But Bulelani, in terms of the economics of your group that you're advocating for and the campaign, could you say a word or two about where you want to go next and what you want viewers to do or how to help you in some way.
So where we see ourselves taking the next move is to actually advocating for the recycling swap shop that I've just emphasized. You know, interestingly, Steve, in our last integrated development plan, we advocated for beautification. And to see that in our local government stats that beautification has increased with 95%, it meant that the start that we actually started is actually a good start. So now we want to move into actually seeing that we advocate people more and we actually emphasize the promotion of health and education. The education element is very important because I feel like when people know what to do with their waste, they will act in a different manner. So we want to actually encourage each and everyone to actually note that there is money in waste and that they should actually take the next step in actually being more cautious of their environment.
And Anesu, final word. Anything you'd like to say to Higher Education Today audience that we have forgotten?
There are lots of opportunities in recycling and sustainability, and I think people should consider it as a viable career.
That's interesting. And in terms of the career aspect of it, let's just encourage people to get into this field, both in terms of cleaning up their communities and in terms of career. That's a great way to end the segment. Thank you all. If you would like additional information about Anesu or Melanie or Bulelani's efforts, please go to africancenterforcities.net or orasa.org.za. That's orasa.org.za, or hashtag keep Mbekweni clean. If you would like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.